One thing I have always said consistently over the years is that there's a distinction between acquiring knowledge, having this knowledge, and applying the knowledge, with the last bit by far being the most difficult. And this can apply to all manner of things. Even in the abstract sense, you can have a rudimentary knowledge of physics and lack the ability to apply it. Oftentimes this comes down to actual misunderstanding and deficiencies in the understanding of the material or the subject matter. But more often than not, it's simply a question of when to know and how you apply said knowledge. Abstract things tend to be a lot easier, things like physics or mathematics or engineering, because they're far more detached from the things we regard as important as human beings, as thinking apes. What becomes much more difficult in its application is knowledge related to biology, psychology, and general human interaction. And this is especially true of the so-called red pill. When we talk about the red pill in the context of the manosphere, of course, we're referring to the knowledge one acquires about male and female nature and how the sexes, generally speaking, interact. And frankly speaking, applying that knowledge is one of the most difficult feats a man can achieve. So today I want to take the time to talk about red pill men who still wish to pursue relationships, not even necessarily marriage, because I know a bunch of these guys. And here's where it gets really, really tricky with the application of the knowledge. This is about having knowledge in the abstract and applying it to something that tugs at you and pulls at you, frankly speaking, emotionally and at your core. Because generally speaking, as a rule, the most primitive of instincts take over. You're no longer necessarily in control or at the steering wheel. And it's under those circumstances that the application of so-called red pill knowledge can be most useful, both in restraining yourself and exercising caution, but oftentimes that falls by the wayside. Now, this may or may not be the same thing as one blowjob away. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But there's a huge range of men within the manosphere, and specifically MGTOW, and some of them range from so-called MGTOW monk to just keeping to themselves, to being hugely social, to dating, to long-term relationships, etc., etc. I think marriage probably is a category that could no longer apply. That's a discussion that's been had before. I'm not interested in rehashing that. But we have this range. And for the men who want to pursue relationships but still consider themselves red-pilled, the real challenge comes into play in my observation, observing these men, having had discussions with them, when push comes to shove. So throughout the courtship period, they might have applied red pill knowledge, they might have maintained their understanding, but once they settle into these relationships, there are certain issues that arise. And we have to be aware that fundamentally there's always an asymmetry in every relationship between a man and a woman. It's never 50-50. Usually, one person wields more power than the other. Now, I'm not claiming that relationships are fundamentally or necessarily only about power, but there is a power dynamic. And we would all be remiss in not mentioning that and paying attention to that. There's this false notion that human male-female interactions are purely cooperative, when we know that there can be real conflicts of interest, and where there's a conflict of interest, there's also a power dynamic. And the issue that arises here is that because these men are already in these long-term relationships, they, over time, allow not only their knowledge to decay, but their application. And I've seen many, many cases of men that have, for lack of a better word, cucked to the female desires of their partners or their girlfriends because, frankly speaking, it made their lives easier in some sense. I think it's something that I've observed time and again amongst blue-pilled men is that there's a kind of stilling, soothing aspect to allowing yourself to become an obedient worker drone, for example, who simply does as he's told. I've talked about this before. I think there are many men who do not like the prospect of freedom, as absolute as it might be in this case. And so it's a lot easier. And the idea of standing your ground in a relationship, maintaining your principles, maintaining your knowledge and applying that knowledge becomes a really, really difficult thing and becomes critical. I've seen this time and again where the man in question was going his own way, stumbles across a relationship, was not, say, categorically opposed to the idea, and little by little seems to give in to the demands of his female partner without really considering all the things he loses in the process. And I wouldn't necessarily call that going back to the plantation so much as losing your ability to apply things and forgetting who you were. Because when the hormones are kicking in, when your life is being driven crazy through nagging or horrible moods, we all know what that's like, or we've been there before, then yeah, it's easy to not stand your ground and give in and try to make concessions. But the issue here is that in this context, making concessions always leads to having to make more concessions. And oftentimes it can either shift the power dynamic, or if the power dynamic was already in favor of the female, then it further pushes the power in her hands. Again, there's a power dynamic at play. It's not the only thing, but it is there. And people who pretend otherwise are either trying to smooth over the reality we live in, or they're in denial. There is no absolute cooperation between men and women. There never has been. It's always been rough around the edges at best. And so the idea here is that when you're in that situation, and a lot of guys have come to me with these problems, I typically ask them what it was about going their own way that appealed to them and what it was about the relationship that drew them in. And more often than not, they'll tell me something to the effect of, well, she was good looking, she seemed okay, something to that effect, really superficial stuff. And the reasons they give for going their own way are, of course, a bit more complex. They like the freedom, they like the money that they can save. They like, of course, in the context of a relationship, the lack of nagging, the lack of obligations, that sort of thing. And it usually becomes clear to me in the course of such a conversation that whatever these men are getting in these relationships, it does not hold a candle to what they had prior in terms of the opportunities presented to them, life opportunities, freedom of movement, the ability to do what they wanted. And I think at the end of the day, isn't that why we all decide to go our own way, to do more or less what we want, as long as we're not harming anybody, to not have to listen to nagging and demands, to be able to save money for ourselves or save money to invest in a hobby, to be able to have free time to cogitate and think about the world, all these things. Frankly speaking, they go hand in hand with a freedom that's likely only achievable if you do not participate in relationships, and certainly not marriage. And there are plenty of guys who are never red pill, never MGTOW, who completely supplicate their female partners and just give up. They essentially become the property of the female and become effectively tools or slaves. And they're actually happy in that role. I know many such men, and you might know such men as well. But I think it's always good to remind ourselves of why we originally made that decision. And that's what I try to do when these guys come to me with these questions and these situations they're in. More often than not, they're young-ish. And so a lot of that has to do with just exploring the final stages of their interest in women or trying to get something out of their system. But I only need for myself to pay attention to friends who are still in so-called relationships, to be potently reminded each time of why I chose the path I chose. Because I do not want to be nagged. I do not want to have these obligations. I do not want to deal with the chicanery. And listening to a haranguing harridan make demands of me as if she had a fundamental right to do so is just not something I'm interested in. And I think most men, indeed, are not. They make concessions, which is not the same thing. So at the end of the day, as we move along in life, we need to remind ourselves why we've made the decisions we made. And if you're going your own way, sometimes we need to remind ourselves why that's the case. Sometimes it's easy to take it for granted. In the case of these younger guys who still want to get out of their system, it becomes more difficult. But I think ultimately most of them are going to realize that the juice is famously not worth the squeeze. Everything's a trade-off. In this case, the trade-off is far too great because the sex is going to get old, as will the relationship. And you'll realize what you've lost in due time. Gentlemen, take care. Enjoy your weekend. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.